and welcome to the NGINX Coffee Klatch. From the German, the term Coffee Klatch means coffee and gossip. And as the name implies, this is an informal chat. During this, you'll get to hear about things open sourcey, meet some of the people behind open source both within and without NGINX, and maybe even learn something new here. I'm Dave McAllister. I'm the open source technologist here at NGINX, part of F5. And with me today is Elijah Zupancic. Elijah, give me a quick background. What do you do here at NGINX and F5?
Okay, well, all the architects within the NGINX group roll up to me. A lot of my day-to-day is really communication, facilitation between various product groups, as well as getting into the nitty-gritty of software architecture with our different products within NGINX, but I'm also the mission owner of AI Gateway. So
Oh,
lately I am wearing two very distinct hats of two different colors, one green, one red, and having to balance my time between both.
very cool. And, I actually met you back when you were part of what was Community and Alliances Engineering, and you worked on some of the coolest things I got to go talk about as well. So, but I want to just kind of dive into this because you're at a high enough level. NGINX, the web server caching, blah, blah, blah project started as open source, was released in 2004. But what's your view of open source software at NGINX today?
Yeah, so if you take an overview of everything we offer, you have one view of the world, and then if you just singularly focus on Nginx and Unit, you have a different view of the world. And I think that's important to look at that in those two different angles. Nginx and Unit have very permissive licenses that allow for broad adoption and grassroots use of both products. We've taken a similar strategy with all of the supporting software that helps enable people to be using Nginx and Unit. I mean, we have Ansible, we have Let's Encrypt NJS scripts, we have things that enable S3 backend support for Nginx. We have Rust bindings for Nginx and a whole host. And I know, Dave, you've managed a number of these repositories and looked at them. I can't even say them all. Do you have an idea of the count?
87 public repositories as of last Friday.
And open source, even though we may be using the same licenses across these, I see there's a qualitative difference that I can't quite put my finger on between them. Even though they're the same license, they kind of have a different energy to the projects. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you start looking at these various projects and they kind of break down into, as you pointed out, sort of a data plane approach with those product sets. And then there's a supporting aspect. There's actually a third category that comes into play, which is, and it's kind of weird to say, but it's the communication aspect. It's the Kubernetes ingress. It's the gateway fabric approaches to the world. And you kind of went through this, but we've got some majors. It's about 9 really major ones that hit here. But if you were going to pick something out that nobody kind of knows about, well, what would you pick for people to go take a look at?
Well, I would say it's not that nobody knows about it, but it hasn't gotten the spotlight yet, and that would be NGF, Network Gateway Fabric.
Hmm.
This is where Kubernetes is heading in the future for controlling ingress workflows. I haven't spent enough time looking at the standard myself, but I can definitely start to see there's this groundswell of support.
Yep. I'm gonna hype the one that I like to hype, and I know that you've got a little bit of experience itself, which is OpenTelemetry.
Mm.
You actually did some work a couple of years ago now about seeing how we could add OpenTelemetry and distributed tracing into a model reference architecture project. Since then, we NGINX have released our own OpenTelemetry module for NGINX, which meets all the kind of things we focus on here, which is speed, stability, and reliability, as well as letting you see what's going on with your trace through NGINX rather than the trace of NGINX. So near and dear to my heart. You also mentioned, for instance, the continuous deployment. I'll put in my other plug for the OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry's semantic conventions just approved the CI/CD semantic conventions.
Oh,
So there's
awesome.
already an open source project which will let you attach to GitHub and track all of the events and alignment to your OpenTelemetry data. It's very cool. Okay, so we've been touching a little bit on the Nginx side, but there's a big world of open source, and I know that you've dabbled in a lot of things. What's your favorite non-Nginx open source project?
Well, okay. I got a few favorites. I can't. What's my favorite child? Um, I, I really enjoyed Trino, formerly Presto,
Hmm.
um, for its. I don't know if probably those in the audience are not familiar with it, but it is a big data technology that allows you to query n number of backend data stores, and they implement these as drivers. So you could be an object store, it could be a SQL server, it could be flat files, and then it has particular driver optimizations for read. And then you can n scale out all of the data processing workers. And so, I remember working on this and writing a data format driver for it and having 64 processor systems running as workers and being able to query petabytes of data on an object store and get back answers in sub-second results. But the
Nice.
coolest thing was watching all of the CPUs light up at 100% utilization as this thing was doing some magic, being able to concurrently pull data from different files on object storage and then process it concurrently. And
Wow.
just seeing that utilization across all of them at once and then getting your answer was just so satisfying. So I really like that one in terms of features and even the ease of which you could implement a data driver for it. But in like more broadly, I really have a soft spot in my heart for the Apache Commons projects
Hmm.
because of how kind early in my career all the mentors were in onboarding me into the Apache way of working and really just like walking me through the process, mentoring me, helping guide my contributions and showing me how to work on the mailing list and then adding me as Facebook friends and me getting to watch, what their hobbies were. It was a really, really positive experience that shaped my thinking about open source.
Yeah. I will admit the Apache Foundation does one of the best mentoring jobs for projects. And I've worked with them at a former company where we moved projects that were our projects into full Apache control. And the mentoring process and the way that they set it up and their step by step guidance, they never ever abandoned you. It was
Yeah.
so great an experience.
Yeah,
So
even
that's
when you got it totally wrong, they're like, "Okay, let's start over," and,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
they are really, really good at that. So, we sort of verged into sort of a foundation approach, and Nginx and F5 are both members of lots of open source foundations here. But open source has had some interesting times recently. We've seen relicensing of things.
Mhm.
Most recently, popular projects being abandoned, and now we're even seeing even more security concerns coming up in open source. You know, but big companies depend on open source. It's very true. So how do you think that companies should help constrain or help solve some of these issues?
Well, these are Elijah's opinions and not the opinions of F5. Let me tell
Correct.
you this, right? Um,
Correct. Absolutely.
I would say, and you probably have a better handle on these figures, but globally, there's got to be hundreds of billions of dollars of productivity reaped from open source projects.
Yep.
Being able to share code without encumbrances and the productivity benefits to developers of being able to rapidly deploy solutions, be able to debug things quicker because the code is right there. I remember back in the day using proprietary libraries, and
Oh,
it was a particular kind of hell to debug it. And just by having open source libraries, it's so much easier to root cause problems. Even Windows has huge pillars of support of open source within its own code base.
yeah.
Um,
Networking stack.
yeah,
Network.
um, it's through and through all of modern computing. However, the people who've put in their life energy into these projects arguably have not been compensated in accordance to the contribution to the global economy. And then zoom out of the people, and then you look at the maverick companies that rolled out open source as part of their business models. They're dealing with a big frustration of not feeling a fair compensation for what they've offered the market. And I think that is why we're seeing a lot of this, not friction, but flip flopping or rethinking of these models. Because although there's like open source maximalists like Stallman, there's a lot of people that are thinking about this as fair play.
Yeah. And Richard Stallman was somewhere, pointing his finger at you, shaking, and going, "It's free software, not open source." Um,
Yes.
so, you do bring up some interesting points. Open source invades everything, permeates everything, drives a lot of the innovations we see these days. But it's unfortunately easy for certain business models to take advantage of other people's work. And I think that's the problem, is that open source itself is not a business model, and people are now trying to figure out what the business model is, moving into a world of SaaS enabled applications. So that's going to be kind of a challenge going forward.
Well, there's a trend also that's happening that I don't know quite how it's going to affect open source, but supply side security.
Yes.
It's becoming really, I don't know what's the adjective, horrific. After speaking to people that are tasked with managing security for cargo, they're getting supply chain attacks every day from malicious actors. And
Yep.
it can be, and just because cargo is centralized, they can detect it. But things like Go dependencies where there's no centralization, there's no central place to detect this,
Right.
right? We're Open source projects are being targeted specifically for manipulation by bad actors. We might see a convergence where the industry will have to just compensate open source projects at some level for supply side security or guarantees in some manner.
Yep. That actually might be something that has to happen. And honestly, as an open source geek from before open source got coined, I wouldn't be too unhappy if that showed up as well. So, you know, uh, sort of, we've talked a lot about open source. We've talked about the projects here, but there's a lot of people that have never been involved in open source. So, if you were giving advice for somebody on how to get started, where would you suggest they start?
Well, like with most things in software, I tell people to get started with joy, right? You got to be really honest about what is going to motivate you to work on something on the weekends or the evenings. And if you're just grinding for some sort of like reputational prize, it's probably going to be really hard or it's just going to be a burden on you. So keep
Yep.
that in foremost. Basically, I see two paths. You can contribute to something like an Apache project. They're often great at, as I mentioned before, at mentoring you. And even if it's a very small change, ideally a small change, they'll take you into the whole process and ways of working. And you'll get an Apache email address and be welcome to the club. It's an excellent way to start out with open source. Another way that's similar is doing GitHub PRs for projects, but
Mhm.
that is kind of like diving in the deep end, um, because you have to learn the conventions that are often unspoken between
Mhm.
developers. Start really small, like fix some documentation or a script or something. Start small, develop relationships with people, and then grow in your contribution. And then there's another tact, and that is write your own open source project library and become a maintainer. And you're organically going to be thrust in all the problems of being a maintainer and develop great empathy for the people that you'll be submitting software patches to after you've done the role of a maintainer. And I think, like being a well-rounded open source contributor, you've ping-ponged between these points a number of times and really kind of start to have like an intuitive understanding of the person on the other side of the pull request.
So, well, Elijah, I'm running out of time for you. I really appreciate you coming and sharing our thoughts with us today. It's been, as always, informative, enlightening, and just fun, just purely fun here. And I'd like to thank all of y'all for joining us here today and meeting some of the people behind the power of open source. If you've got your own thoughts or ideas, feel free to add them to the comments below. And with that, until next time, may the open source be with you.
Thank you, Dave.